Welcome back to DC Thursdays. I'm Pete Soderling. I am your Sherpa through the data ecosystem. We talk to leaders of open source projects, we talk to data co-founders of companies, and generally give you the information you need to know about the emerging tech data space. So I wanted to thank all of our listeners and audience who have been so faithfully attending these programs over the last 6+ months. We've built up quite a following, and you guys are generating a lot of buzz in the community for us. We're glad that you've been enjoying the guests, and we want to continue to bring the show faithfully to you. So thanks for all your support. And as you know, we have a special format around here where you get to ask questions in real time in the chat on YouTube. So we're excited to make these amazing guests available to you, and please take advantage of feeling free to jump in the chat at any point in time you might have a question for our guest. So today I'm super excited to invite Patrick Thompson, who's the co-founder and CEO of Iteratively. Patrick, welcome, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Pete. Yeah, glad to have you as the Sherpa along this journey.
Well, I do my best, and it's super rewarding to be able to talk to so many smart folks in the data ecosystem. And now you're here, so with your yellow background, so we get to have a fun chat today. So just to get started, so people have some context as to where you come from. I know that you sort of ended up at Atlassian immediately before Iteratively, and I'm sure there's lots of interesting lessons learned there. But talk to us about the earliest stages of your career. How did you get involved in data?
Yeah, good question. For me, my background's primarily in business. So academically, I have a business degree, but actually originally started as a CS in information systems in academia, and then ended up switching out to business and getting my master's in business. But my first job was actually more doing conversion rate optimization. So using tools like Site Catalyst and Test and Target and really trying to improve e-commerce performance. So that was my kind of first step into using data to actually help drive growth for businesses. And that got me into design and how do customers and users think, and what is the psychology behind those steps that they take within their journey. And that really kind of ended up giving me the first step into design, which I then transitioned over into more of a product design role, and then ended up moving to the Bay and working at a variety of different startups there. But really kind of always taking my business background and trying to understand what success looks like and what the outcome for the business and the customer looks like, and applying that to the work that I do. And eventually ended up meeting my co-founder now, Andre, at his company, Simplicity, when we worked together for about 3 years, primarily in the sync and share space. And then I ended up joining Atlassian because I was really passionate about solving problems for software teams, and joined the growth team there, where, again, it was very design-led. It's the best way to describe it. And then, it inevitably ended up leaving to go work on, a second act together with Andre with Iteratively.
Fascinating. So there's a business background, there's a design background, there's even some interest in CS from back in the day. It's fascinating how you put all those things together.
Master of none. Jack of all trades, master of none. Let's just say that.
And now you get to add startup founder and CEO to your list. You must be afraid of nothing.
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely the culmination of all the thirsts come together as a founder, but this is definitely the most exciting step I've had in my journey so far.
Well, I'm sure that this journey of working your way through product design and really embracing the way users see and benefit and interact with products, it seems obvious in the way that it sort of led you to start Iteratively. But what was the core insight? I typically find that founders have some key insight regarding why they start their company. What was the key insight, and when did you receive that led to you starting Iteratively?
Yeah. So to be completely frank, Andre and I actually knew we wanted to go solve problems for startup teams, but we didn't know what problem we wanted to solve. We knew, we were basically just planning on building the airplane on the way down and jumping off the cliff. So we left I left Atlassian in the beginning of 2019. We spent about 6 months doing customer research, primarily talking to data analysts, growth marketers, data scientists, engineers, just trying to see what pain points that they had in their day-to-day. That's kind of when we ended up hearing repeatedly issues that customers were having with the data that they're capturing and how they were using that data internally. And so that's really what led us to the insight, was primarily just customer development and just listening to the pain points that folks had. And inevitably, after about 6 months, we did a bunch of research, ended up uncovering this particular insight that we had, and decided to build a company around it.
Hmm. And so how did Atlassian at the time, for example, capture data around their products?
A good question. So we actually, the exact problem that we ended up hearing from a bunch of different companies we had at Atlassian. And while I was on the growth team, we built a bunch of an internal tooling to actually help solve this. We built our own experimentation platform. We built our own audience management platform. We built our own event collection platform. And these were all things that inevitably we had to stitch together. And the biggest pain point that we kept on seeing time and time again, even at Atlassian, was just not trusting the data that we're capturing. Quite often it was messy, inconsistent, and unreliable. And so I was really surprised. I thought this was just an Atlassian problem. I was really surprised when we went out and talked to a bunch of other companies, and they're having similar pain points and having to build similar tooling outside as well, because there's no real good solution for them to use to solve this. At Atlassian, we ended up building kind of a blacklist. You can think of it as a registry that would effectively operate as a data dictionary and would validate all the data flowing into the data pipeline, put bad data into a dead letter queue, and then validate the data and let it pass through to the data warehouse or into third-party tools like Amplitude. But that was something that we spent, I think even today, there's a team working on maintaining that infrastructure internally. And yeah, so our goal at Iteratively is to avoid folks having to build their own solutions, or to build a better solution than any team could do and manage internally, so they don't have to, they can go work on more higher value adds for their business.
And you must have spoken to many other customers or potential customers during those days. I'm sure some of which were maybe represented by the larger tech companies of Atlassian size, who were likely, I assume, solving this problem on their own internally.
100%. Yeah, we did. I mean, at this point, we've done over 450 interviews across the board, many organizations. We saw, obviously, like there's the Atlassians, the Airbnbs, the Ubers, the HubSpots, the Circle CIs, the Airtaskers, who had all built internal tooling, the Cloudflares of the world, the Canvas of the world. They all had built internal tooling. Nothing in the market was really meeting their needs. They were potentially migrating from third-party solutions to first-party solutions when they're building their own data platforms as well. And yeah, we took a lot of inspiration from the tooling that we saw them building internally, and decided to kind of productize something that was effectively, similar to what they had done, but just in a slightly different way, focusing on collaboration across data consumers inside the organization, and then focusing on building out a best-in-class developer experience for instrumentation as well.
Got it. Well, let's jump into a little bit about Iteratively. Talk to us as concretely as you can about what the product does and why it's a massive need. You mentioned that you discovered that data quality was an issue at Atlassian in terms of the event data and the product data that you were capturing. Talk to us about sort of the guiding principles behind Iteratively and how it solves these problems.
Yeah, happy to. And I think it's probably worth jumping into kind of some of the pain points that we see companies struggle with when it comes to their customer telemetry, their clickstream, the behavioral analytics data that they're capturing, and how they're using this data as a business. Obviously, it's very easy to think of this data, the data use cases here for BI and reporting and understanding the performance of your products. What are the key success metrics that you have? There's other use cases around marketing automation, or using this data to trigger campaigns and onboarding experiences, and or even in product messaging as another example. There's a bunch of companies using this data for personalization or retargeting. So there's a variety of different stakeholders and consumers of this data within an organization. But inevitably, what we kept on seeing time and time again is you had data consumers on one side of the table and data producers on the other. And that the best thing that most organizations had to really try to corral this mess was a spreadsheet or a Confluence page or some sort of wiki that they're using to define their analytics. And with Iteratively, we wanted to kind of build a best-in-class collaboration platform where people can go in, define all of their events, all of the data that they want to capture, all the properties of these events, in a really easy to use application that kind of applies a lot of the same principles that we get from software engineering around versioning and peer review, and apply that to schema. So effectively, you can think of Iteratively as really twofold. One is a schema registry where you define your analytics. And the second thing is a developer toolkit that developers use that really takes that schema and generates type-safe SDKs that improves the overall quality of the data that you're capturing, integrates it into your existing test suite, whether or not you have integration tests with Cypress or Selenium or Jest, and then also integrates with CI, CD to effectively break the build if analytics break upstream. We want to be as proactive when it comes to solving these issues, not reactive, solving them downstream once you've already released new software.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And so how is your schema registry, how does that compare with this sort of data dictionary that you described from the Atlassian days? Have there been meaningful advancements in that particular piece of the stack, or is that talk to us a little bit more deeply about how that works?
Yeah, the last one was pretty simple. It was just it was a web application that we wrote that allowed somebody to go and define an event and a set of properties or a JSON payload for that event, and then would validate against that. The Iteratively registry takes a lot of the same principles, but a much easier UI to use for non-technical folks like product managers and analysts, who are the ones who are typically maintaining the schema internally. And we've also built in a lot of integrations with downstream tools or even upstream tools as well, specifically around like being able to notify teams when things are changing, be able to have an approval process and kind of better ACLs or rules and permissions across the organization. So quite often in big organizations that we work with, Box as an example, they want to be able to review any of the changes that are being made to that schema. And any of the new instrumentation that's being defined, so that, as an example, you're not capturing PI information and sending that to downstream third-party SaaS solution. So we built a really good review process around the entire process of defining your analytics and getting that actually instrumented by developers. So we have a lot of the similar concepts like branching and pull requests built into Iteratively as well.
Got it. So what's an example of bad data in a system? Like how does bad data in the sense, bad customer data, bad product analytics data, how does this show up downstream? What are some concrete examples of that?
The three easiest examples that we see all the time is one, like you have your iOS team send an event called user signed in and your Android team send an event called user logged in. And downstream, those are represented as two particular events. But if you're a product manager and analyst, you have to go then create a join, munch the data to actually get to a particular business metric that you're trying to answer around how many logins did we have for the business. And this happens time and time again. And so iteratively, we solved that problem by creating a single place where you go and define that event, you associate it across those two different teams, and each of the teams get an SDK that matches exactly what you need as a data consumer. The other thing that we see quite often is developers and setting a string instead of a number or float instead of an int, not really thinking through a lot of what properties they're actually sending, or not giving you the right properties that you need downstream in order to particularly meet the use case that you're using that data for. And the other thing that is pretty common as well is generally analytics is untested and a bit of an afterthought for most organizations, which means that it breaks pretty frequently. So you might have a developer go in, refactor some code, inevitably they drop an event or they change a property, and no one understands until it's too late. You've already shipped that change to production. Your dashboards break, your machine learning models break, your marketing automation breaks, and then inevitably you either have to try to get a hot fix out the door or you have to wait till your next release cycle to fix it. And that happens pretty frequently with folks, and there's just no real good way for them to detect these issues other than building out their own anomaly detection systems or hoping that somebody inevitably just looks at a report and detects it.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And so then who are the main users of the Iteratively product? How do you define your ideal customer profile and sort of what different touch points and groups around the business typically integrate with Iteratively?
Yeah, we primarily work with SaaS B2C and e-commerce companies today. The folks that we typically work with and who bring us into these organizations are the data team. So it is the head of data, head of BI, the head of analytics, who inevitably have teams who are consumers of this data, typically data scientists or data analysts, who are pretty much hamstrung by the quality of the data that they're capturing, and they have no real good framework to bring your product manager on board, to bring your engineers on board, to kind of corral this mess. So those are typically the folks that we work with. It's very much analytics is a team sport. We want the product managers to be involved. We want the engineers to be involved. We want the data analysts to be involved, to think really about what success looks like for their business, and then to be able to represent that into kind of a lower level schema that gets defined and the events that get defined inside of your inside of Iteratively.
Mm-hmm. So then, do you effectively operate as a sort of a data router in the middle of these, all of this event tracking, or like where do you sit architecturally in the value chain?
Yeah, so we're as far left as you can get. So you can think of Iteratively as kind of a governance tool, workflow tool on top of your analytics schema, and then we'll generate the SDKs that sit inside of your source code. So we integrate into all of your different platforms, including iOS, Android, your backend, your front end, wherever you're emitting events from. And we sit there and we'll actually send the data directly to any of the destinations you want to send that data to, including tools like Amplitude or Mixpanel or Segment or Snowplow Analytics. Wherever you want to route that data, we'll actually federate that data directly from the client once it's actually validated and passed validation. And then initially, if you have your own data pipeline, you have something like Kinesis or Kafka set up with a particular endpoint, we can actually wrap your own third-party API or your own third-party analytics client and send data to your own custom data platform as well.
So you start at the collectors. You are the JavaScript bugs that are instrumented in web pages that send this uniform data, and those bugs are sending uniform data because they're generated by sort of the core iteratively schema registry / brain that is being used by the customer to define the core metrics in the first place.
That's correct. Yeah, we have a CLI that developers use to auto-generate those SDKs, and those SDKs include exactly one for one what was defined in the spec inside of the registry.
Got it. So there's no transformations required. It's not like you're taking data from other people's SDKs or trackers. You sort of assume that it's your tracker that's been instrumented in the end application.
Correct. That is correct.
Got it. And how did you think about the tracking component of this? Because there's obviously a bunch of companies that do similar things. I think you chose to open source your trackers. Is that right?
Yeah.
So you must feel like that. I mean, talk to me about that notion and sort of strategically how you got to the point where you decided to open source those bits of your platform.
Yeah, I mean, we've been very thoughtful about what we open source and what kind of remains close source, at least for the time being with Iteratively. I think one of the things that we think about from an open source perspective is how do we build enough value from an open source perspective where you can still maintain value even if you decide to migrate off of Iteratively. But today, when it comes to the SDKs, like this is code that you're shipping as part of your production software. So we want to make sure that there's no issues long-term if you decide that you want to migrate off of Iteratively, or if this wasn't a good fit, we'd be sad to see you go, but we want to make sure that you don't have any obligation to rip out our source code. So everything that ships in your client is yours to keep. It's very much open source code. There's no dependency upon our platform.
That's neat. That's awesome. Well, let's dig into some more of the downstream features. I mean, I think I have a better understanding now of what you mean by tracking plan. You talk about tracking plan in some of your collateral, and essentially that's the interaction of the customer with the schema registry to define what they want tracked, perhaps what they don't want tracked. And then you also mentioned that there's some collaboration and branching features. Is that surrounding the tracking plan? Or talk to me about how you've overlaid some of these typical traditional software engineering notions into this concept of customer data tracking.
Yeah, no, great question. And when we think about tracking plan is kind of the industry terms, canonical example of what the data dictionary looks like. And for Iteratively, you can think of Iteratively as just a contract between all the different folks within your organization. So if you have a product manager, an analyst, a data scientist, data consumers of these events, it allows you to effectively create a contract between those consumers and the engineers who are actually responsible for emitting that data to whatever data pipeline or tool that you're sending that data to. And one of the things that we saw that was pretty apparent early on is the fact that we wanted to apply a lot of the best practice engineering examples around versioning and collaboration to schema, similar to what is done to code. So Iteratively is effectively a version controlled schema registry in the sense that every event is versioned. So if you were to change a particular event, add a property as an example, we would increment or auto increment based on schema ver. We took a lot of inspiration from all the fine work that the folks have done at Snowplow Analytics to make sure that effectively you can think of your schema as code and be able to evolve it over time as your needs of the business change. Vice versa, we want to make it really easy for you to understand backwards compatibility or incompatibility changes on schema. So, if you effectively have a required property, that required property has to be required for the life of the event. What is the impact downstream on your data warehouse if you were to evolve that schema? If you were to add additional properties or try to change the property types of that. Like, this is all a lot of complexity where folks generally don't understand the downstream impacts of changes that they make upstream when it comes to tracking, that we're trying to at least surface to folks as they go about changing the schema.
And at the same time that you can version the schema or move at a different spot in time to a different schema, I assume the tracking values, the data itself, can be referenced against that older schema if you wanted to. So you're essentially not losing any data through that process. Is that the way it works?
Correct. Yeah, you're not losing any data. The other thing is all versions of the schema are always queryable. So we have a RESTful API where you can use to query all the schemas, request a particular version of the schema, request all schemas, or request all versions of a particular event as well. And the nice thing about that is we do have customers who actually use those schemas to do the data validation as part of their pipeline as well. So effectively makes it really easy if you decide to change things to validate it's a new schema or validate your old events against an old schema if you have a particular old version of an iOS client or an Android client out there in the wild still, effectively making it, at least effectively making the data that ends up into your data lake or your data warehouse high quality.
Great. So what are some other features of Iteratively that we should know about?
Yeah, good question. I mean, right now we're primarily focusing on improving collaboration and improving quality of the data that you're capturing. One of the things that we're actually releasing next month, which we're pretty excited about, is the ability to give you some inferences on making sure that the schema is actually validating. So today we don't process any of your data. So really been a really helpful thing for us, but actually being able to know as part of your SDSC, like, hey, how many events aren't passing schema validation? What new events are we seeing that may not be using the strongly typed SDKs as an example, are very much feature requests that we're getting from our customers. So we're launching a feature next month, which will allow folks to get a better sense of the quality of the data that they're actually capturing and routing to their third-party analytics providers. And
this is implemented by discovering some data that's not explicitly being captured. Is that right?
Correct. So this is implemented by us being able to process the metadata around your analytics events. Previously, that might not necessarily be defined with the Iteratively Analytics SDK.
Got it. Really interesting. So we talked about commenting and branching. We talked about the developer experience, about the schema registry. Are there security concerns with the way data flows through Iteratively and other customer data platforms? How do you think about security and user privacy and all those things? Because obviously, data governance and privacy is always a hot button issue, especially as more customer data starts to be captured by systems like yours.
100%. I mean, it's the first question that comes up typically when we work with larger enterprise organizations as well. I mean, the nice thing today is that everything in Iteratively is configurable, and by default, we don't process any of your customer data. So you don't have to worry about us being a data subprocessor in the context of GDPR. We work with many customers who are in Europe, and the nice thing about the way that we've designed the system and architected it from the ground up is that we don't have to worry about that. In the sense, the only data that we see is your employee information related to the users and roles within our platform, and then the metadata around the schema, which has been super helpful. Effectively, one of the things that customers actually look for Iteratively for as a solution is ways to actually enforce better rules and governance on what analytics they actually do capture about their customers. So one of our key value props is around actually enabling kind of creating that data map for organizations on defining what data that they're capturing, why is this data being captured, how is this data being used downstream, and then effectively giving them guide rails on being able to approve or reject any changes to the tracking plan that data consumers might be making.
Yeah, I can see that as being a core benefit of the centralized schema registry, is that it allows for easier audit and sort of understanding across business functions of what data is actually being captured. Because if it's not in the schema registry, it shouldn't be captured, at least not by Iteratively.
There's a huge problem, and like this was one of the biggest pain points that we heard when we were doing customer discovery is like, I have this data flowing into my data warehouse, I have no idea where it's coming from. And then obviously event lineage comes up quite often, and it's a really hot topic within this space. But like for us, like we're in source code, so we know exactly where each event is being emitted from to the line number in source code, and then like where that data is being sent. So like there's a huge advantage for us in that particular realm, and then being able to tie into like tools like dbt downstream for documentation is something that we're very excited by, so that you as a data consumer and know exactly from what report you're generating all the way to where it's being emitted. So if there is a problem, you can actually go easily debug it and understand kind of the impact that problem has on your business.
Got it. So we have our first question from Wyatt. Thanks, Wyatt, for the question. So far, you mentioned monitoring internally generated events ingested by an analytics team. Are there use cases where a data service provider could publish this to another company consuming the data?
We've had a few requests for a capability like this from a few of our customers who do publish like kind of events that their customers use. We haven't done anything particular to enable that. There's one feature that we have, which is around public documentation. So the schema that you store inside of Iteratively is always exportable, but we also generate public docs here. And it is obviously queryable, and you can send a link to anybody around the documentation for your events that you have. We obviously see a lot of folks wanting to create an event dictionary that they share with their customers, and then kind of be able to productize or export like different reports using Looker or other types of tools for external reporting. So we do see this as something that we might be able to help facilitate, but we haven't done anything particularly useful here other than being able to generate external documentation.
And where does Iteratively store the data? Because presumably that data could be grabbed by the customer and sort of piped out to other places or shared with other partners manually if they preferred. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, all the schemas are exportable. So we don't actually store any customer data in the sense of like your end user's data, but we do store the schema, and that schema is always exportable. So you can export that as JSON schema. You can send that anywhere else. And we always generate up-to-date documentation. So similar to Swagger, if you've ever used Swagger for API docs, we have a link that you can send anybody related to what's the current state of tracking for your business.
Got it. Cool. So in terms of sort of taking a step back and thinking about the broader market, the customer data platform world is full of competitors and people throwing elbows and different products and tools. How do you see yourself as sort of fitting in that world more broadly? How do you position Iteratively either to be collaborative or competitive with other solutions?
Yeah, there's a lot of pointy elbows, but like generally we're very complementary to many of the tools that exist out there today, including the amplitudes, the mixed panels, the segments, the rudder stacks of the world. So like we're not trying to we know exactly kind of where we add value, which is specifically around kind of governance of analytics. For us, like our number one goal is to improve the quality of the data that you're capturing so that you can trust it downstream. And there aren't that many other options that teams have today beyond a spreadsheet or building an internal solution. So that's kind of where our MO, at least today, is. When we think about ways that we can help in the future, it really comes down to improving the overall collaboration, being able to provide you some level of monitoring and visibility into the health of your analytics, And then, yeah, partnering with really good partners who care about this as equally as much as we do. And we are doing a lot of partnerships today to actually kind of help facilitate better communication and data capture for tools like Amplitude and Mixpanel as an example.
Got it. I guess what my notion of the industry and sort of the way it's emerging has been, you have the 2-ton elephant in the room, which is kind of Segment, and sometimes they get to be expensive for particular use cases. They're quite expansive in their product features. They're a hosted platform, and so they can charge what they want to some extent. It seems like there's a whole new breed of tools that are popping up that are kind of picking away at certain portions of what Segment does and allowing a savvy team to essentially sort of create a bespoke tracking customer data infrastructure internally. And you've mentioned Snowplow, you've mentioned tools like dbt, which are more general, but are still, I think, used in some of these workflows. It seems like you sort of fit a particular piece of this bespoke stack where a customer can sort of recreate their own segment with either open source or closed source tools, but other services that are really best of breed at doing one specific thing in this whole value chain. Is that a fair way to sort of see the industry and the way it's sort of emerging right now?
Definitely fair. And like one of the people I really like is Ben Thompson. He always talks about bundling or unbundling of software. And like, you could effectively think of a lot of these bespoke tools that are emerging as doing one thing very, very well that Segment has done in the past. Obviously, Segment has changed their pricing, and we work really well with Segment today, and we have quite a few Segment customers. But we do see other companies who decide like, hey, this isn't necessarily the right thing for us given the cost or given our growth, or us at least wanting to own our own data. So we do see teams who are using Iteratively as kind of a way to kind of govern those analytics that they might have been able to do in other tools in the past. And that has been very, very helpful for us, at least early on for our growth. And then, yeah, partnering with either companies like Snowplow for the data warehouse integration, or being able to federate the data to third-party SaaS tools, which we do natively today.
And is there a typical customer deployment of Iteratively? Do you see the same 2 or 3 tools, on the right-hand side of your integrations, like consistently? Like what's most popular in terms of a typical customer implementation?
Yeah, I mean, I see like in broad strokes, I think the 2 types of destinations that folks try to build out into their data stack today is obviously integration with the data warehouse, whether or not that's using something like Snowplow or a custom data pipeline, or using something like Amplitude data pipelines as an example, and then putting the data into Amplitude and then using Fivetran or something else to move that data to their data warehouse. We do see folks wanting their event streaming data in the Feather data warehouse and then into third-party SaaS tools like Amplitude to enable sort of self-service analytics for other consumers within their organization. That's pretty typical of what we see. Other things that come up pretty often are things like Iterable or Braze or AppsFlyer, or more of these marketing-esque type growth platforms for messaging and attribution. So those come up quite often when you think about kind of a broader growth stack that teams are trying to build, at least when it comes to their event streaming data. So that's pretty clear. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of dbt. I love what they're doing. So we see that as kind of probably one of the fastest growing tools, at least of the customer conversations that we're having. And yeah, that definitely does a really good job when you think about kind of being able to build audiences or on top of your data warehouse. That definitely does come up as well.
Yeah, got it. I wonder if you have thoughts on sort of the next generation of tooling as well, because it seems like I've been having this chat with founders, and we've spent the last 5+ years really working to the left of the data warehouse. And there's tools like Iteratively and Snowplow and others that are dbt that are sort of getting the clean data finally into the data warehouse so that it can be used. I wonder if we're sort of getting ready for the next iteration of that evolution, where the tools to the right of the data warehouse or built on top of the data warehouse, sometimes is the paradigm used, will start to be quite interesting. Because getting the data into the clean data into the data warehouse even though it's been all consuming for us for the last, 5+ years, now that we're starting to have systems that are getting us there, now some of the questions starts to shift to, oh my God, now what can I do with this data? I can pipe it to my sales and marketing apps. And there's tools like High Touch and Census that are popping up to do that. Do you have any view of sort of that side of the space? Are there more things that people can do with data that gets through iteratively, ends up in the warehouse that they haven't even thought of yet?
Yeah, no, good question. And I think operationalizing the data warehouse as a source of truth is like a huge advantage that companies have. That hasn't really been, I think, powerful enough, at least in the past with the existing tools and the existing vendors on the market. I think the source of truth inevitably will end up becoming the data warehouse. I think being able to have kind of reverse ETL solutions makes a lot of sense. I think the question obviously comes like, are they only reverse ETL solutions? Are the ELT and like and the reverse side like all built into one tool is obviously kind of an ongoing conversation that the market has. I'm actually really interested in kind of the data cataloging space as well. Like you have like Data Hub and a bunch of other types of tools that are emerging, which obviously when data warehouse becomes a source of truth and you have an explosion of data consumers who are using that as a source of truth, like how do you manage that and how do you govern that as well? So I'm very excited by what they're doing. And then, yeah, I've chatted with the Census and High Touch team, and yeah, I think that they're on the right path. There's a bunch of other tools that are emerging there now as well. It's definitely an explosion within that space.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see how the next 5 years plays out and what we can do with all this clean data, thanks to companies like Iteratively, now that we have clean data in the data warehouse.
Yeah.
So as you know, we're very much a community-oriented organization. I started Data Council as a meetup in 2013 and became a conference in 2015. We've been working with the data community for a long time. I'm just curious as to sort of what your vision and values are for Iteratively as a community, as a company participating in the data community. Sometimes it's easier perhaps for a straight up full-blown open source company to like do that community thing because that's kind of their lifeblood and they kind of have to. But I know that you have thoughts on the way that Iteratively can be a good actor in the overall ecosystem, and I'm curious to hear like how you're shaping the culture of the company and some examples of ways that you're doing that.
Yeah, no, and I think this is probably one of my favorite questions so far. So I mean, for us, like we want to be super authentic with who we operate with, how we operate as a company. And we spent 6 months doing customer discovery. So we got to know this community before we ever had a product, before we wrote a single line of code, and found the value and the willingness to help that a lot of people extended us as we were newcomers into this community. And so definitely want to have the same mentality of paying it forward and providing immensely more value than what we're taking away. And that's kind of been how we've been operating from the get-go. And there are plenty of people that are probably going to listen to this who I could not tell you how thankful I am for your support. And generally, like I think the things that I like the best about the data community is how helpful people are. It's been interesting transitioning from building tools for software teams, primarily engineers and product managers, to building tools for data analysts and data scientists and heads of data. Yeah, it's just been a very humbling experience to have folks be very open with providing feedback and support. And I think when we think about the company that we want to build, it's definitely one where culture is super important for us. We were very determined before we even made our first hire to define and codify what the culture that Andre and I wanted to build for the company. That really came down to things like being super transparent, not just internally with our employees, but with our customers and the overall community, being impactful. Like we wanted to, obviously, we left really nice jobs to go be impactful, make a difference in this world. And we found a problem that we're really excited to solve for a community that we're really excited to be part of. And the last was to be inclusive and make sure that we're allowing other voices to be heard and allowing folks to feel like they can bring their whole selves to work. And that was one of the things that we were very motivated to do. And that comes into, and these values are everything from how we make decisions as a business to who we decide to hire and how we decide to engage with the community. We're very authentic in that. And we hope that comes across with the folks who are listening to this and the folks who've engaged with us in the past and other communities as well. Yeah, and that's kind of how we operate as a business. And I'd say like one of the things that I'm very thankful for is to have folks who've joined us on this journey who care about these values as much as we do as founders.
Yeah, that's great. Well, you have a lot of good company in data space in terms of people who appreciate what you're doing and and the value that you're able to bring. And as we said before, there's an explosion of tools and all sort of spot tools in different niches of the space. And so I think being a good actor and not just from a company value standpoint, but it sort of filters down into practical things like integrations and how you integrate with other people. And I think that that's definitely a way to do good and to win, in this ecosystem, because it requires a very much of a collaboration effort.
100%.
On the company building side, like what are the biggest lessons you've learned starting a company? Because obviously there's lots of folks in our community who are thinking about leaving their cushy tech job maybe and venturing out and starting something in the data world. And we like to support them and give them advice where we can. So now it's your turn to give them advice. Like what have you learned? What were the gotchas? What are some nuggets of wisdom that you can pass on to the community?
Yeah, I think for me, it's probably the most valuable experience I've had so far, to be honest. So I'm very thankful to have this opportunity and the privilege to be able to go do a startup. Not everybody can do that. I'm very fortunate from that perspective. I'd also say like you're not always gonna get it right and like be okay making bad decisions and being wrong and having to learn from those mistakes. So there's definitely many mistakes that I've made over the last 2 years and lessons that I've had to take away from that. So, but understand that like that's part of the experience as well. Like you'll grow from that. I'd say the other thing that was super important for us is we spent a lot of time doing customer development. And I wouldn't trade that for anything in the world. Like that was how we got our first customers. That's how we realized that we were building a problem, or we found a problem we're solving and building a product that people would actually want to use. And so that whole experience was immensely helpful for making sure we weren't wasting the years that we had on this planet to just build a product and hope people came, or hope that we were building the right thing. We're very customer centric with what we do. And then lastly, again, like your early customers define you. So like making sure that you're partnering with people who share your vision, who are going to be very good thought partners. So we had the opportunity to work with, great teams like Dribble and Beekeeper and Artifact Uprising. And they were very, very instrumental in getting us to where we are today. And so, yeah, I'd say like you are defined by the people that you work with and the customers that you have.
Defined by the customers you keep.
Yeah, it's true. Not all customers are good customers. So that's also another lesson.
Versus the company you keep.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a great chat, Patrick. I'm curious, just before we let you go, is there something that's been particularly surprising for you about your work in the data ecosystem so far?
Yeah, it's I mean, for me, it's interesting. We're very methodical about kind of how we approach design and product, in the sense of like we're solving different challenges for a different community than we were building, tools for software teams coming from Atlassian. But there's a lot of similarities when it comes to, obviously, tooling is only one aspect of the problems. Like tooling doesn't solve organizational issues, and there's a lot of obviously organizational issues that we can. That's a whole nother podcast that we can get into, whole nother webinar. The organizational issues when it comes to software are very similar to when it comes to data. And we have a bunch of things like TDD and CD and extreme programming that have kind of emerged out of the agile space over the last 10 years as a outcome of similar problems that I observe in the data space. And I'm very confident that in that regard, we'll see similar changes in the way that teams operate, specifically within the data community over the next few years. I already see some of those changes happening today. And dbt is a great example of a tool who's helping facilitate a lot of those kind of organizational change or best practices that come from a software engineering background. There are other tools that are emerging there as well. But I think, yeah, the space is still very much in kind of its infancy, and there's going to be a lot of progress made, step change differences made over the next few years. So yeah, very excited to see what that looks like, and hopefully help be able to provide some help there ourselves.
Yeah, for sure. There's lots of lessons that we've learned as an industry when you think about it, the software development field is not, it's only a few decades old.
Yep.
And so in the same way that software development process has evolved and changed over time, and now we're starting to apply overlap of some of those insights to the world of data in ML ops and data quality and pipelines and transformations and other things. I think we're in a really golden era of data tooling, and so it's great to see more thoughtful people like yourself, applying lessons learned in previous careers or previous generations of their career, and then sort of bringing those best practices and that mentality to the data engineering, the data science, the analytics world. I think it's definitely required, and really salute you for your clear thinking in that way.
Thanks, Pete.
Yeah, it was great to have you, Patrick. Thanks for being with us and for sharing your wisdom with our community.
It's great being here.
So just a couple announcements before we wrap up. I want to let people know that Data Council has been running our 2021 open source data tools survey. It's caught on like wildfire in the community. We've had hundreds and hundreds of responses, thousands of tools referenced in the survey. There's one more day to complete the survey before Friday tomorrow. We'll put a link to it in the chat window. And so we'd love it if everyone listening would fill in your favorite open source data tools, share it with your friends. It's basically a one survey question. We made it as dead simple and as quick to take as possible. So you can literally do it in 20 seconds. So please do that and sound off on your favorite open source tools in the community. Also, just a reminder to folks who are listening, I'm a 4-time startup founder myself. I love to help engineers and other people in our community figure out how to get their companies off the ground. I have a few office hour slots that I make available for the community every month. I'd welcome you to click through if you want to talk to me for half an hour, share with me your idea, get feedback. I love to have office hours with the community, and so just wanted to put the call out for folks there that might want to take advantage of that. Finally, next week, we'll have Matt Rockland from Coiled, the company behind Dask. We're really excited about that.